Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at the ICS seminar. I'll just make a very few brief opening remarks. So India has a fairly complex border management system with different forces responsible for different borders. So on the international border with Pakistan and with Bangladesh, the responsibility is that of the Border Security Force. As you go into the line of control section of Jammu and Kashmir, the line of control is manned by the Indian Army, and there are also BSF units which are deployed in this area, and those BSF units are under the operational control of the Army. The Indo-Nepal and the Indo-Bhutan border is manned by the Seema Suraksha Bal, and the Indo-Myanmar border is manned by the Assam Rifles. So you have different agencies. Now, coming to the line of actual control, which is the de facto, defining line of the border between India and China, the operational responsibility of the border is that of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. But we also have a unique situation along this border. We have the army also deployed in fairly large numbers to assist with the border management. So today, Dr. Jacob will be telling us about, the role, organizational, and the responsibilities of the Indo-Tibet Border Police. And thereafter, after his talk is over, we can look at whether, effective border management, etc., is being done on the LAC, whether some changes are required. So with these remarks, I hand you over to Dr. Jacob to start his presentation. Dr. Jacob.
Thank you, John Hooda. Let me begin by thanking the Institute of Chinese Studies for this invitation, and to John Hooda himself, of course, for agreeing to chair this session. I think with his experience, there's much that we can all benefit. Let me also acknowledge that there are several from the ITBP also in this audience, whose views also we hope to take on board. And also, I'd like to thank my colleague, Namrata Hasija, who was very helpful in putting together much of the research, a lot of the research for this particular exercise. At the outset, I'd also want to say that this particular work is part of a chapter that I'm doing for Carnegie India, which is a larger project on national security institutions. And in that chapter that I'm doing, I'm actually looking at both the ITBP and the SSB, the Satrastra Seema Bal, which covers the Nepal-Bhutan borders. But for this particular presentation, I thought I'd look at China, the context of China, or the India's relationship with China, and to look at this particular institution, the ITBP. My last presentation at the ICS was a discussion of a book that I co-edited with a Vietnamese colleague on China's national rejuvenation. It is a pure China domestic and foreign policy book. And national rejuvenation is not only an exercise in rhetoric and propaganda, but it's also about strengthening institutions. So I'm hoping that with this particular exercise on the ITBP, we can also look at how to rejuvenate India's institutions and how to prevent them from floundering or failing. It's exactly 1 year since Galwan, and we've really not had an accountability exercise since then. But I hope that we will focus on more than just that one incident and look at the run-up to that incident. The policy decisions, the institutional frailties that are part of this entire process. And this presentation on the place of the ITBP in India's China policy making is just one part of this examination. Now, I look at three major documentary sources for this work. One is, of course, the official website of the ITBP. There's plenty of data out there, ITBP magazines, and their own explanation or version of the history and tasks. The annual reports of the Ministry of Home Affairs of various years, those are also available easily online. But also importantly, a 2018 report by the Indian Parliament Standing Committee on Home Affairs titled The Working Conditions in Border Guarding Forces, which is specifically the Assam Rifles, SSB, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, and the Border Security Force. Now, why is the ITBP relatively invisible compared to the Indian Army and the Ministry of External Affairs, which, in India's management of the boundary with China? And even in the past year of very high tensions with China on the LAC in Eastern Ladakh, we saw that, the ITBP is pretty much not present in any of the discussions. So I will divide my presentation. I will address this set of questions by looking at three broad themes. One is the internal organization and dynamics of the ITBP. The other is the mandate of the ITBP and how this has changed over time. And third, I look at the command and control issues that Jung Hooda just referred to. So part A, the internal organizations and dynamics. There's no other way to put it, but that there is a class issue at play here. The degree of importance that hierarchy and rank have in the Indian government mean that the ITBP is often treated as something of a poor cousin. It isn't enough to get a sarkari naukri, but it has to be a particular kind of government job in India today. The levels of segmentation, the lal battis, bells and whistles, pay grades that government officials manage to divide themselves by is, well, unsurprising at one level, but also equally astonishing for the kind of impact it has on effective functioning of government. And this is a republic, the Republic of India, where all citizens are supposed to be equal. But it's really far from the case, even when it comes to important national security issues. And an expression I've heard frequently from the ITBP is "na idhar ka na udhar ka." So neither here we don't belong in either area. I mean, under either official part of important decisions. They're just they're just told to do a task and they carry out the task. That's it. But a change in the situation has been underway for some years now. The first batch of CAPF officers coming through the UPSC exams joined duty in 2006. And as a result, there has been a certain degree of pushback to this treatment of the ITBP cadre within the government. You've seen, for those of you who are aware, there's been the filing of representations before the High Court and the Supreme Court for considering the CAPFs as organized a group of services. And for what they call the NFFU, the non-functional financial upgradation status. The fact is that the High Court ruled in their favor, the Supreme Court upheld the decision, but the government has so far refused to implement the order. So that's where dynamics between the ITBP cadre and their authorities is at. And there's a leadership interest issue here. The ITBP's highest echelons are manned by the Indian Police Service officers. Why? It's a question that needs to be answered. One could call this an anomalous situation, but this apparently is this is a very normal situation across CAPFs. So at the DIG rank, 80% of the officers on the ITBP, come from the ITBP cadre, with 20% are IPS officers. One step above, at the IG rank, 50% are IPS officers and 50% are ITBP cadre. But the DGP, the highest position in this organization, is always an IPS officer. And there are some serious issues here, because if you look at the DIG level, an ITBP cadre officer might take up to 30 years to get to the DIG rank. But his counterpart from the IPS will have only served about 14, 15 years to make it to the DIG rank. So there's this huge gap in experience alone between two officers of the same rank, but coming from two different streams. In the past, I believe IPS officers used to join at the commandant level, but apparently this stopped because of the implementation of the Sixth Pay Commission. And so I suppose there's a bit of a pay parity and status issue here, why this has happened. And one consistently hears that the IPS is simply not interested in the ITBP. This is not to say that IPS officers do not do their job, but there is something more than just doing the job. I mean, it's about thinking about organizational interest, organizational reforms, addressing problems of over-deployment, mission creep, and also willingness to be trained for this particular task. I mean, at the moment, it's not very clear what the qualifications are for IPS officers to take charge in a rather specialized organization that the ITBP is. I mean, it operates in mountains, so what is the level of training, etc., that IPS officers have in order to get to this particular, pick up their DIG positions at the ITBP. And just a few days ago, in fact, there was a report in the Amar Ujala which said that a large number of vacancies, DIG vacancies in the CAPFs that are allotted to the IPS remain vacant. And not only are they remaining vacant, those vacancies are not really filled by cadre officers who are eligible for them. In fact, an ITBP frontier headquarters for Leh, which is currently our area of interest, which has an IG officer rank, was only moved to Leh in 2018. And it took a long time for this decision to be implemented, even after it was taken. So there is now an IG rank officer at the frontier headquarters in Leh, and I think about 3 DIG rank officers in Ladakh. But at the bottom of it, if you think about it, the Army, Navy, Air Force have the leadership at the top echelon, in fact, come from the NDA. I mean, people who join the service or training at the age of 18 or 17 and, have carried on. And so it's completely internal. Whereas the ITBP at the top will never be officered by somebody who spent 30 years in the organization. It'll never have leadership from its own ranks. And why this difference exists between two organizations that both serve the Republic of India is a question that we all need to ask ourselves. Additionally, cadre review just doesn't take place. The Department of Personnel and Training in the government mandates that a cadre review has to take place every 5 years. And as far as I know, the last cadre review in the ITBP took place in 2019 after about 20 years. Similarly, department promotional committees just don't meet. Promotions are just not handed out on time. There's a long, and this is a serious issue that was pointed out also by the parliamentary committee, which is there's a great deal of stagnation in the ranks in ITBP, and not just the ITBP, but also the other services. There's sometimes an anomalous situation where there are more posts, but less people eligible, or there are more people eligible, but less posts available. So in a sense, the NSFU is undermined in multiple ways. So the core issue here is really of morale. How do you expect that a force that is done in so obviously by its own government will perform an efficient and a good job in the task that it is allotted? Let me come to part 2, which is the question of mandate. Now, the original mandate, as any MHA annual report will point out, the ITBP was formed on the 24th of October, 62. That is just within days of the Chinese attack. And the MHA points out that the original mandate was to reorganize frontier intelligence and security along the Indo-Tibetan border, to serve as a guerrilla fighting force, and to be self-contained in supplies, communications, and intelligence collection. Today, you will know that this is quite far. I mean, the ITBP has traveled quite a distance from this. Even right after, in 65 and 71, the ITBP was involved in the two Pakistan wars. But essentially from 78, by the MHA's own language, the ITBP turned into a conventional, quote unquote, conventional border guarding force. And the Indo-Tibetan Border Police Act of 1992 says the ITBP's role is ensuring the security of the borders of India and performing such other duties as may be entrusted to it by the central government. So such other duties is a catch-all phrase. So what happens is that under the MHA, whenever a problem arises, let's say electoral extremism or a requirement of providing security for elections, it seems the case that those in charge find it easier to redirect CAPF battalion from its original duties. So today we have something called mission creep in the case of the ITBP. The ITBP not only mans the LAC, it provides assistance during the Kailash and Amarnath Yatras. It provides disaster relief in the mountains. It also provides guard duties for Rashtrapati Bhavan, Tihar Jail, the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy in Mussoorie, to the Rumtek Monastery in Sikkim. It's involved in election duties, internal security duties, anti-Naxal operations, embassy protection in Afghanistan. The consulates as well as the embassy in Afghanistan are the responsibility of the ITBP. And in addition, even on the LAC, the ITBP is called on to provide support to civilian administration in terms of medical camps, healthcare, etc., for villages on the border. I mean, in a sense, the ITBP does both its job of guarding the border, but also civilian administration tasks. And post article and the abrogation of Article 370, again, you know, there was pressure on the ITBP when it was switched from LAC tasks to internal security tasks. What's happening is that while posts are not entirely abandoned, personnel are being reduced at the different these posts because personnel are being diverted. So in a sense, what we have is we are harking back to this penny packet approach of the forward policy under Nehru, where you might have posts which are not adequately manned for the purposes that they have. And you know, even last year in Ladakh, I think the case has been that the Chinese did not ingress into those areas where our troops were present. They went into those areas where we were not present. So this thinning out of posts, I think, has a consequence. And the ITBP today has about 56 battalions. And of these, only about 40 odd, or perhaps even less, are actually deployed on the LAC. The others are in internal security duties, about 10 of them, specialist battalions, national disaster relief, and so on. And a few battalions are reserved for rest and recuperation and so on. As far as the ITBP itself is concerned, one thing needs to be highlighted, which is while it's called the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, with the change of mandate, you know, the focus on Tibet, knowledge of Tibet, etc., has sort of declined in importance. There is no, or there is very little, if at all, any capacity in Chinese language, Tibetan language within the ITBP. And one has to wonder if this force is called what it is, if its mandate is what it is, why is it that these issues, I mean, such expertise is not available within the ITBP. In addition, there are issues of tensions between local populations and the ITBP because of, say, problems in cultural, cultural context or cultural conflicts. It's not necessarily always the case that the locals believe that the ITBP or even the armed forces are necessarily cognizant of local practices and so on. So there are some of these tensions which have been pointed out in various academic works. There is in fact a paper by Professor Siddiq Wahid on the RIS website, which about the Changtang plane. I think it's a 2014 paper, which actually points out to some of these issues. And I'd like to thank Professor Siddiq Wahid for highlighting this paper a little while ago. Let me come to the third part, which is issues of command and control. Now, as General Hooda just mentioned, you know, there's been a demand for the ITBP to come under the operational control of the army. And I suppose the logic is that this is to make it easier for faster and smoother reactions to situations on the LAC. But before we get into this, please note that the army itself exercises different kinds of operational control currently, you know, over the two other border guarding forces, which is the CAPF and the Assam Rifles. Over the Assam Rifles, this is complete operational control. The Assam Rifle cadre are only engaged in what we call admin duties, personnel issues, service issues relating to the Assam Rifles. In the case of the BSF, it's partial depending on the geography. Not everywhere is the BSF under the Army's operational control. It's only on the LOC with Pakistan that it is. In the case of ITBP, now the Army is seeking a full control. Now, the logic is obviously simple. The LAC has for a long time been a very active border, and if the evidence of the past several years is not enough, at least in 2020, we are now faced with the issue of whether the LAC is a peaceful border or an active hostile border between the two countries. So in a sense, there is a mismatch between the understanding of the army and the understanding of the MHA about the nature of the LAC. The MHA logic has always been that this is a peaceful border, and as per international norms, and because checks and balances are required, it is the ITBP under its control that ought to be manning the border. But it's not entirely clear that issues such as checks and balances, etc., have actually worked in practice. Some also talk about the resistance of IPS officers to serve under the commander, any army commander. And but even in the BSF, I don't think this happens. As I understand it, there would be no place for the IPS at all if operational control were to shift onto to the army. Incidentally, the MOD too has been on record saying that the border guarding forces are operationally placed under the army only when security threat warrants it. So, I mean, this is slightly dated, but one wonders what the MOD's current perception is about the LAC. There is the other issue, which is whether there is a consideration about how China would take this issue, right? If China would, in the past at least, and perhaps this is an MEA consideration, whether the Chinese would take it amiss if the army were to take operational control over the ITBP. Of course, this is now in the past, but there are 4 questions that there are for the army itself. One, what in reality are the disadvantages so far in lack of control? What are the coordination problems that the army actually faces on the ground? That this request is repeatedly made, and this request has been made at least since 1986, and again from 1991 with greater insistence, because 1991, I think there was 1999, sorry, there was an intrusion during Kargil at the Daulat Beg Oldi sector, and the army has been talking about this since then again. I mean, General Hooda himself has, in another document, referred to this as not a recipe for success, the fact that the ITBP is not under the army's control. But currently, from all indications, the army and ITBP work fairly well together. The army has actually recommended several ITBP personnel for commendations and gallantry awards following the incidents in Ladakh last year. So the question is, what specific changes? 2, is there a demonstration effect? I mean, we referred to China before. One argument has been that, counter to the previous government reluctance about, worrying the Chinese, is that the Chinese will think that we are not serious about border security because it is the ITBP and not the army that is on the border. But also, is there something of a demonstration effect? Is there something that the PLA is doing with respect to its border guarding forces that the Indian Army thinks it can do or replicate with the ITBP? 3, does the army want to officer the ITBP? Does it like it does the Assam Rifles? I mean, the army already has a severe shortage of officers. So, and I suppose going by the practice in the BSF, this is not an issue that arises. But 4, how then, in the case of operation control, will the army deal with organizational culture and practice issues? The BSF control, as I pointed out, is a very limited exercise over a very limited geography and a very different kind of a border. Operational control over the ITBP means an operational control over 3,488 kilometers. And the ITBP faces several other issues within. I mean, I talked about issues of stagnation, lack of promotional avenues, etc. The recruitment and the makeup of ITBP battalions and army units are very, very different. I mean, one problem, for example, that happen on patrols is that the age difference between ITBP and the army personnel can be quite wide. So there are obviously performance effects because of this. So how do you deal with these sort of issues is also a question that the army needs to answer. Now, let me come to the ITBP's views, which is there are 3 major views or 4 major views. One, they see nothing wrong really in current operations with the Indian Army. Joint patrols, as far as they're concerned, function fairly smoothly. The leader and deputy leader of patrols keep interchanging. So, I mean, apart from these performance issues, perhaps these are largely okay as far as the ITBP is concerned. They see themselves as the equivalent of any infantry unit or regiment within the army, but with greater specialization for the mountains. 2, the ITBP believe that one advantage of army operational control would be that the army will not be compelled to listen to the MHA's request for diverting ITBP personnel for internal security duties. That the ITBP will perform those tasks for which the ITBP was raised, for which ITBP personnel are mandated. The Army's refusal to be involved in anti-Naxal operations, I think, is something that they hold up as a very good example, as an admirable example of this. Three, there is consideration that the nature of the LAC has changed, and therefore it requires fresh thinking about how the ITBP's role needs to be in this particular situation, that the LAC is no longer a peaceful border. Four, as much as all of this is true, the ITBP do not want one set of overlords replacing another set of overlords. They want greater thought and consideration to be put into the idea of the ITBP as an organization by the powers that be, greater say and respect for ITBP cadre itself within the organization and in the running of these assigned tasks. Now, finally, by way of some conclusion, some thoughts about not just India's China policy making, but also, I suppose, Indian policy making in general. One is that we see a general ad hocism towards thinking and planning an organization in the national security realm. There is a confusion of organizations, and there's a confusion between organizations and agencies and ministries within the government of India. I know some questions perhaps worth considering are whether the ITBP, if shifted to the Army's control, actually adds to the capabilities of the Army in terms of, say, greater leeway for the Mountain Strike Corps. Or is the ITBP nimble enough or capable enough to actually mesh with such plans and structures of the Army as the IBGs, the integrated battalion groups, or theater commands, for example. And given that the Army has been making this request for such a long time, for decades now, why is it that this issue has not been resolved until now? I mean, what does that say about the Indian foreign policy or domestic policy making enterprise entirely? The Army, despite all these years, has not been convinced, obviously, by whatever arguments that the MHA has given, and the MHA has not been convinced by whatever arguments that the Army has been given. So, and this is an intergovernmental conflict which the political class has completely avoided addressing. And I've, barely mentioned the MEA, but I'd expect that the MEA will also have a view on this. I mean, which side is the MEA on? It has to pick a side, obviously. And why wouldn't it pick a side? So what are its reasons either way? Second, the challenges from China are to concentrate the mind. But the efforts in this regard still seem to be piecemeal. Turf battles and institutional self-interest seem to be supreme. They seem to win over larger national objectives. And finally, the big question is, we have to decide about the nature of the LAC. There has to be greater clarity whether this is a live conflict that we have on the LAC with China. And that will then determine also what the nature of the ITBP will be within the Indian-China policy-making establishment. And if we don't address these questions, perhaps we should not be making false comparisons with the LOC because there are differences. But it's still a question that the government needs to answer, and answer pretty quickly, in fact. So let me thank you for your attention. And I understand that we might not have time to take in all questions, but please do reach out to me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. That was a very comprehensive presentation, and I think you've covered all the major aspects, including internal issues about manning, the ITBP officers versus the IPS debate, the issue of the NFFU. You've talked about the mandate and the mission creep, and I think that's important because, as you correctly said, the ITBP is being pulled in all kinds of directions by the MHA, and therefore their main sort of focus on the LAC could sometimes get diluted. And then you've talked about issues of command and control. Let me just make some very brief comments. Let me start by saying that the ITBP soldiers and officers on ground are doing an outstanding job. I think there is no doubt it's one of the most difficult and challenging borders anywhere in the world. and the manner in which they're carrying out their role is praiseworthy. Also, I think there are no issues regarding synergy on the ground, which is between units that are operating, as you mentioned, between patrolling that is going on, joint patrols, etc. The assistance that is provided by the Army to the ITBP and vice versa by the ITBP to the Army. I think on ground, I did not as the Army commander find any problem at all happening in Ladakh. I think there are larger policy issues, and I think you also referred to them, intergovernment issues that we need to, look at, because that actually affects, the overall border management per se, as far as the LAC is concerned. If you recall, the group of ministers that was formed after the Kargil Review Committee had recommended that we must follow a concept of one border, one force. And the reason they gave was very simple, because they said there must be clear operational responsibility. Otherwise, sometimes, the blame game starts and passing on from one to another, saying, no, I was not responsible, he was responsible. So that is the principle, I think, which even the government of India, the Ministry of Home Affairs has accepted, but it's not being applied on ground. If you see all the major incidents that have taken place on the India-China border, recently from the Depsang incident of 2013, Chumar in 2014, Sikkim in 2017 at Doklam, you find that the first reaction and the major reaction to these incidents is by the Army. Now we could ask, why does that take place? And I think it takes place because the Army has the greater capability and ability to be able to respond to these actions. And therefore, if we think that the ITBP should primarily be responsible, why is it in the background? I think what we need to look at is how can we enhance their capability, and capability in which areas? Let's take a frontier, for example, which has 8, 9, 10 battalions of the ITBP. Basically is organized around these 9, 10 battalions. Very little support structures. If you look at an equivalent division in the Army, the division in the Army would come with its logistic support, it would have its transport battalion, it would have its ordnance unit for supplying arms and ammunition, clothing, etc. It comes with its own communication, complete regiment, which is quickly in place to set up emergency communications where required. It has an engineer battalion to provide engineering support. It has an artillery brigade. It has a armored brigade. So just the ability to be able to respond. It has its own dedicated hospitals, etc. So I think we are looking at responding to a regular military. There are limitations in the way in which the ITBP can respond, not because the soldiers are lacking or the officers are lacking, but just because they don't have the organizational structure and the capability to react to it. As far as the point you raised about, how would the Chinese look at if the border management is given to the regular Indian Army? I think the Chinese even now understand that a lot of what is happening on the border is being done by the Army. For example, every border personnel meeting that is held is headed by an Army officer. It could be a routine regular meeting like you have on Independence Day and on May Day, etc., which are completely ceremonial in nature. But those are also attended and led by Army officers. We have ITBP representatives. The hotline between the two sides, between China and India along the LAC, the hotlines are manned by regular Army units. So I think there is no sort of confusion in this, that the Chinese would somehow feel that now the Army has taken on a greater role. They understand that the role is there. The other larger issue is capability development to enhance our ability on the LAC is now being done, frankly, in an uncoordinated manner, because you have two different ministries that are responsible. So raisings, for example, of Army units are being done under the Ministry of Defense. Raisings of ITBP units where they will be deployed, how they will be deployed are being done by the Ministry of Home Affairs. And to me, this is wasteful. On the same border, when you're raising units, deploying them, deciding, what the deployments would be, is wasteful if you have two different organizations doing this. And frankly, we do not ask the Ministry of Home Affairs when we are raising troops. Similarly, when ITBP units are being raised for some sectors, etc. I mean, that coordination with the Ministry of Defense, unfortunately, is not being carried out. It should be. So you have two different forces, two different organizations raising forces for the same border. And so that coordination and capability development, a coordinated response, because both forces report to different ministries, a coordinated response is not being done. You also mentioned, I think there are some shortfalls which the ITBP should look at in how, in their organizational structure. For example, you had numerous 7, 8, 9 ITBP battalions in Ladakh, but the headquarters of the DIG, the IG, etc., nobody was actually present in Ladakh till 2019. And so therefore, how do they respond and where are their headquarters? While as far as the army is concerned, you have the commanding officer, the brigade commander, the division commander. In fact, the corps commander sits in Ladakh. So the response is much faster. In fact, even some of the battalion headquarters, which is the basic sort of unit, even some of those battalion headquarters were not in Ladakh. So while the soldiers were there, the headquarters were out. So this is one area that I think the ITBP could look at. I think it's a good step that they moved in, the IG headquarter into Ladakh, because then response is much faster, because they have their own channel, so they are going through that channel. I mean, they're not they're reporting to the local army units. And finally, I think, as we said, and as you also mentioned, we are going to see the LAC as a hot LAC. That whole idea that, the LAC is peaceful, not a shot has been fired in anger, and therefore the management can be done in somewhat peacetime mode by the ITBP. I think we have to review those ideas now, because it's no longer a kind of a peaceful border. And as we look ahead, we are going to see greater activity. We are seeing greater deployments, which are taking place on both sides. And therefore, in situations like this, I think a reassessment, a rethink, a more, I would say, reasoned debate between the two sides, where, concerns of the ITBP, concerns of the Indian Army can be properly debated and discussed, and we take a sort of a considered decision on whether the ITBP is placed under the operational control of the army. Let me also clarify here that placing of the ITBP under operational control of the army does not mean that there will be any change in their organizational structure, their organizational ethos or culture, their manning, the officering. So the basic organizational structure of the ITBP is just going to remain the same. I think what will happen is there'll be a much more sort of coordinated response, because the command and control channels and lines will be clear. The responses will become much more coherent in case you have to respond to a crisis. And finally, the capability building and capability development plan can be done in a cohesive manner. So when you look at the LAC and say we want to do capability development along the LAC, then that can be done in a more coordinated and comprehensive manner. If on the other hand, we say, no, we want to give the ITBP primary responsibility for this border, then we have to slowly start reducing dependence on the army. And therefore, as I said, reorganize, restructure, and strengthen the capability of the ITBP to be able to handle a border where you are going to see a response from the regular PLA going to come. So I'm afraid with the current capabilities and the current sort of organizational structure, the ITBP is going to find it extremely difficult to do that. So these are my brief comments. But in case you have anything, or then we can open it up for Q&A.
Let me just quickly maybe respond in a minute or so to General Hooda. I think General Hooda makes some very important and considered remarks. I think the issue of command and control really needs to be examined. I mean, clearly this is an issue that academics can only discuss and highlight, but government will have to actually take into account. But to my mind, at least two issues arise here, which is, for example, the issue of raising different units. I mean, I suppose fundamentally the issue is one of civil-military relations. Can the government of India leave? I mean, it's without question that we need more units, more units raised because of the problem on the LAC, right? But is that going to be done by the army, or is it going to be done by the ITBP? It actually speaks to a question of whether the civilian government is comfortable with military forces increasing in that kind of number, right? The other issue is, if the tasks are, as you mentioned, Hooda, and of course, it's not a question only to you, but it's a question that we all need to address, is that if the ITBP is supposed to function like a regular army because it is facing a regular army across the border, then it requires an entire new mindset and role change. And again, it's not only about one organization, which is the ITBP, which is, as you said right at the beginning, I think Hooda said it, that it's a much larger fundamental issue at the highest echelons of government. And the problem here is that the political class does not take ownership of this issue. They do not discuss this. They do not invite opinions. They do not have a debate about this. This is not an issue that is discussed in Parliament enough. And without those things, perhaps, we'll be stuck in limbo. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Yeah, fine, Dr. Jacob. I just want to say, see, I think the stance of the Indian Army is where you have settled borders, and there is absolutely no problem, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, less Jammu and Kashmir. Those are the areas, where the army should not get at all involved in the border management. But where you have unsettled borders, like the line of control, like the LAC, and where you are likely to see regular army from the other side reacting, then it would be better to give the management of these borders to the army. And as I said, it would be also wasteful in case you want to raise, completely army-like structures when the army is already sort of there. It's already deployed in very, very large numbers on the LAC. So, I mean, what's the best arrangement? As I said, there are always two sides to the point. So, let me open it up. I have one question in the chat box by Mr. Shakti Sinha, and he says very thought-provoking. So 2 points he says. One is, how did the ITBP police the LAC in the 70s and 80s when it was much smaller? And 2, is deployment in internal security not done because the ITBP itself wanted diversification, as they said that being in the high mountains was very strenuous? So basically the 2 is, how did the ITBP police the LAC in 70s and 80s when it was much smaller? The second point is, does the ITBP want diversification because you can't have troops deployed in high altitude areas all the time, and therefore, they need a rotation. So.
Right. I mean, I think to the first question, really, the policing function, and even today, I think is largely limited by our infrastructure capabilities. The ITBP, even today, it sits in many areas 10, 50 kilometers away from the LAC, or even more. It takes several days of march on foot to actually reach many of these points that we say belong to us or are our points on the LAC. So I would say that maybe in the past, this was not such a serious issue because the Chinese infrastructure was also not well developed. But today it's an entirely different game. Today, both sides are contending with each other, face to face in many areas. In fact, right now our focus is on Eastern Ladakh, but I think even General Hooda has pointed this out several times before, that the situation in Arunachal Pradesh is much worse in terms of access and capacity issues. So there is that consideration. Now, in terms of the second question, which is, okay. I think here is where about the ITBP's diversification. Look, certainly there is a problem within the ITBP in that the ITBP is pulled from what they call extreme high altitude or areas to still more difficult tasks. I mean, I'll give you a simple example. In 2017, the bunch of ITBP units were pulled in to take care of the Amarnath Yatra. But right after, there were some disturbances in Kashmir, so that same unit remained in Kashmir. Then soon after, there were local elections, so that the unit was again deployed in the same area for election duties. And then when finally this unit was relieved, it went back to a hardship posting. It had no R&R. So partly the problem is of how the MHA is managing this issue, and partly the problem is of leadership. I think this is a question that keeps coming. The leadership doesn't care where the ITBP units are posted. It's as simple as that. It's about filling a gap that the MHA sees needs to be filled.
Let me just add to that, 70s, 80s, and how were they doing it? So the Indian Army has always been deployed on the borders. So it's not as if the Army was not there and, only the ITBP was doing. I recall I was deployed in Sikkim in mid-1980s. There were 2 full infantry divisions that were deployed, and there was at that time not a single ITBP unit which was there. So as I said, this whole management of the border is something that we need to look at in detail. Let me take another question from Pia. It's from ThePrint, and the class issue that you talked about in the ITBP. I think she's referring to the IAS versus IPS. IPS versus the ITBP issue. If it will have a trickle-down effect on other critical border forces.
I think this is an issue across all the border guarding forces, all the PFs and all the paramilitaries. This is not an issue limited only to the ITBP. I mean, the entire counterterms of over the NFFU is a case in point. The government has still not implemented, and I'd invite you to speak to perhaps retired officials from these organizations to get a full picture.
So let me just take, I think it's from Rohil, with respect to the mandate, considering the police aspect of the ITBP, would it be more appropriate if it would transition to a force responsible for unmarked intruders, individuals crossing the border, and border insurgencies, where the Chinese state may not have sanctioned the action? With incidents where uniformed, marked incursions take place, the army and specialized regiments would be the appropriate response. Trying to say if along the border you could give a separate kind of responsibility to the ITBP and a separate responsibility to the army.
Well, I mean, this particular thing about intruders and so on, this is not a serious issue along the LAC. I mean, the Chinese man their borders very, very tightly, especially over the last few years. There's very few Tibetans able to escape across, or those escaping across the LAC. So this question really, I mean, it doesn't arise. I mean, then the ITBP is really left with no role. The issue is really, then the ITBP would have to be retrained and reorganized entirely from this task. I suppose the question is, look, do we need an ITBP, or do you let everything be done by the army, right? I mean, this is a decision that the government will have to take. But this is also not a decision that we can take overnight. This has to be planned and thought through. And the new raisings that General Hooda pointed out, will have to be done keeping these objectives or these questions in mind.
I also think it would be impractical. I mean, if you actually see the deployment, there are areas where the army units are there, and then there are areas where there is ITBP, then again there is army. So to say that all along the border you would have the ITBP doing some separate role and the army doing some, I think practically, it may not be feasible to do that. So they'll have to do some similar job. And as Dr. Jacob has pointed out, as opposed to the Pakistan border where you have issues of smuggling and people trying to sneak inside. That kind of activity doesn't happen. The Chinese border is much more strongly manned. So Dr. Jagannath he's saying, General Hooda had mentioned about enhancing the ITBP capabilities. Could you please explain what sort of capabilities? Then he talks about border surveillance system is far from perfect and largely depends on manpower rather than new technology. Do you think ITBP should be given drones? Thanks. So when I mentioned, what I did say was that in case you want that the ITBP should be able to man the border, and the responsibility should be completely that of the ITBP, and the army is only required during wartime, for example. In which case you'll have to give them capabilities to be able to respond to Chinese. When the Chinese came in these incursions, they just didn't come with some foot soldiers marching. They came in with tanks, they came in with ICVs, they deployed their artillery behind. So I was talking in, that's the kind of capabilities that are required when you are responding to a maneuver by a military force. And those capabilities are there with the army. So I think uh, if we can combine the capabilities of the two sides, that would be a much better option. Do we need much better surveillance along the LAC? Absolutely. Not only drones, I think satellites, larger UAVs, electronic detection systems, everything is required. I have no hesitation in saying that our surveillance systems along the LAC are not what it should be. Some of it, of course, is because our infrastructure is poor on our side, and therefore, even reaching the border by foot patrols, particularly in Arunachal Pradesh, is difficult. So, deploying surveillance elements is, a huge kind of challenge. But better surveillance capability, the short answer is yes, we do need better surveillance capability and much better intelligence on what is happening inside Tibet. So that would, I think, in some ways could have given us a little more warning, even in the incident that happened in Eastern Ladakh last year, where we were frankly surprised, by the scale of the Chinese incursions.
May I just take a minute to this? I mean,
sure.
I think this is not such a bad idea. I mean, if at all you're going to raise new units, I think we might pick a lesson from the Chinese, which is in terms of how they are going for qualified people with technological degrees, skills. I mean, this is a vast border, a long border, a bunch of personnel that are maybe specialized in the geography, the environment, satellite imagery. Specialized technical tasks might be a way of reorganizing and reforming the ITBP. I mean, it's certainly, why not? I mean, we need an army for the future, for the 21st century. So this certainly is a consideration.
So, Dr. Jacob, this seems like a difficult question. So, he says, why is ITBP called police and not a force? So, we have like BSF and Assam Rifles, which are forces. So, why only ITBP is called the police rather than a force?
Okay, that I'm not quite sure, but I think part of it has to come from the history of the organizations. These were originally raised with policemen in charge, IB in charge. So this is partly one of the. I mean, I have to look a little more into the history. This question has never occurred to me. But let me just say that it is interesting to note that the SSB, the Sashastra Seema Bal, is the only security organization in India that goes by a non-English name. Now, why is that? So I suppose there's a lot of discussion that we can have on this.
So, Dr. Jacob, the next question is about training infrastructure, and it says the training infrastructure has been described as abysmal compared to the other forces. And so your thoughts on this in context of reforms in training infrastructure. I don't know, as part of your study, if you also looked at, the training methodologies and training standards, etc.
So I wouldn't say that the training is inadequate, or that but I would say yes, there is a problem in so far as the time available for training, precisely because units are deployed practically around the year, and they do not have time for R&R. In fact, my sense is that ITBP officers have to be creative, that they actually pull out certain segments, certain units within battalions deployed, so that they sort of rotate units or sections within the units in order to ensure that everybody gets adequate rest, adequate training time, and so on. But look, essentially the training depends on the mandate that you have. And now with new duties, IS duties and so on, I think there's now a greater emphasis on training for intelligence operations, etc., and so on. But remember, original mandates of intelligence gathering on the LAC, those have actually probably slipped. And like I mentioned, if they do not have language capabilities, there's very little intelligence that they're going to be able to collect. And in any case, many of these tasks are actually the Army's primary responsibility, not necessarily the ITBP's.
Let me just also add, Dr. Jacob, that I haven't found any great shortfall in terms of, the individual training, at least, that ITBP soldiers over there are, inadequately trained or not able to do their task or role or something. I know there is an age issue, operating in these high altitude areas, but I didn't find that, individual capacities are sort of limited.
I agree.
So we have a view, I think, from Paras Thapa, and maybe you can just sort of comment. And he says the need of the hour is not op control of one border guarding force, but synergy among all stakeholders of national security, Army, CAPF. Any ITBP unit can today match the same capabilities as infantry unit in terms of firepower. Lateral entry only in terms of taking command of units is no way out. Cohesion among existing forces with other organizations will surely enhance national security. When the matter of merging Assam Rifles with ITBP came a while back, MOD vehemently opposed it, presumably. So,
well, yeah, I think it's that last point that is at the heart of the issue here. I mean, look, each of these forces were raised with a specific mandate. They each have specific tasks, and the ITBP, I think, more than many others, is a very, very specialized role. So it would be a pity to waste them in non-specialized tasks, right? The issue is they're trained for this, and one needs to be able to make the best use of it. I mean, this wasteful word, I think, is very important. It's not just in terms of actual financial resources, but also human resources. Why is it that the ITBP is not in the task that it is mandated to do? And yes, there is this sort of conflict constantly. Sometimes there's talk of the ITBP taking over the SSB's roles. Sometimes there's talk of ITBP taking over the Assam Rifles roles. But the Myanmar border is a very different border from the LAC. And if the Assam Rifles, and remember, the ITBP actually took over from the Assam Rifles in Arunachal Pradesh only. I mean, it's been not so long. I think it's only in the 2000s that it actually took over. And even then, some tasks have not entirely reverted to the ITBP. So there's a big gap between ideas, government orders, implementation, and we sort of seem to muddle along rather than have a coherent policy about keeping troops ready and fit for the operations that they are assigned for. But General Hooda, I'm sure you have more to say on this.
No, so I completely agree with the thought that there must be greater synergy among stakeholders. The only sort of view I was expressing is, how do you get that synergy? Is that synergy, can it be done when you have two forces reporting to different ministries, doing capability development in their own sort of independent, stovepipes? Or is there some better way of doing this? So, I mean, I think there is no doubt that we need a much more sort of comprehensive approach. We are only discussing as to what is the best way of doing it. And as I said, there are viewpoints on both sides. So I think we respect them. Now there is, I think, another observation, from Ritesh Raina. He says in India, we have a habit of tying ourselves in knots. The inability to call a spade and trying to come across as good guys. I come from a corporate background, and this kind of setup would be a short recipe for disaster if there was to be a project implementation. Do you believe this is a workable organizational structure in case of an active border? And I think we've talked about this, but if you want to comment on it.
So the objective of this particular presentation is precisely to get people to think about this issue a bit more closely. I mean, I see that there's a lot of people in this particular meeting, which is not something that I quite expected. But I think it shows that people, especially since what happened last year, we need to look at it's not just a question of capabilities in terms of our firepower and so on. There's a great deal of man management, training, planning, forward planning that goes into all of these things, which we have ignored for a very long time. And I think this discussion, I hope, opens up this debate. You're right that any corporate setup with this sort of mixed lines of communication, mixed lines of authority would not work. But at the same time, we need to be able to deal with the problem as is. I mean, there's a certain set of people who are hired for a particular task as the ITBP has. How do you retrain? How do you manage this issue? Needs to be, they also need to be taken on board in terms of how this entire process needs to be structured. It's not as if the ITBP lacks capable people who haven't thought deeply about the boundary, people who haven't thought about China. I know personally, I've been to several ITBP sessions where they've talked in detail about China-related issues, and these sort of things are happening now. So it's happening, but it's a question of leadership. Somebody at the top ought to be able to knock heads together if need be, and we have to give up our own insecurities in terms of turf and pelf. That is also a big part of the Indian government system. And let's not kid ourselves. This also happens in the corporate world. It's not as if Indian corporates cover themselves in glory, given what's happening in the country right now. So I suppose it's not an issue limited to any one organization or any one arm of government. It's an across the government sort of problem. Yeah, but I'm happy to offer my shoulder for people to fire at each other if it can generate reforms.
See, let me just add, as Dr. Jacob pointed out, this issue of command control of ITBP, management of the LAC has been going on since 1986, and the army has, been saying that it would be better if ITBP is placed under its operational control. Things were fine as long as the border was sort of peaceful and there were no major incidents happening. I think now we need to debate this much more. If we take the assumption, and the assumption is probably right, that you're going to see a more sort of aggressive stance by the Chinese army along the LAC, you'll find a more active LAC, then possibly I think we have to revisit, and we can't just leave this issue anymore. I think we need a more cohesive kind of response on the border. So Arvind is asking, why is there visible apathy shown by the government in solving the issues related to the LAC, and more specifically the ITBP and its systemic issue? Is it because there are multiple ministries involved with very less cohesion, or is it a historical problem starting with 1962 war?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that just because we have multiple ministries that they wouldn't be or shouldn't be able to work together. Let me come back to the issue of the MHA's running of the ITBP. I think as long as the ITBP cadre cannot be promoted to leadership positions, running their own organizations with their years of experience as to what specific problems that they themselves face, we will always have a situation where there is there's a mismatch between what the government says and what actually happens on the ground. I would say in many ways the ITBP and the army sort of work together much better, perhaps, than the leadership of the ITBP and the ITBP cadre itself. I mean, it's a huge moral issue that the ITBP has not received the NFFU in practice. I mean, these have nothing to do with the boundary or whatever pressure that the Chinese put on us. This is an entirely internal issue, which could actually be solved with a stroke of signature, with the stroke of a pen, if the government put its mind to it. But it simply is not happening. And those are issues beyond China.
So, Dr. Jacob, Shraddha is asking to both of us, should ITBP personnel study Chinese and Tibetan language? And I think you answered it in some way. So.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is part of the specialization of the ITBP. And I mean, what about just Tibetan and Chinese, but also the local languages? Arunachal is an area of multiple ethnicities and multiple languages. The Mishmis are spread across the LAC on both sides. So obviously, you will need to develop that kind of specialization. But this then brings me back to the other question, which is about the hardship posting. I mean, it cannot also be that the ITBP is constantly in a hardship posting. But look, the mandate is, the identity of the organization is such that it is called the ITBP for whatever it's worth. And therefore, this will necessarily have to be part of the operational capabilities that the ITBP picks up. Language skills, mountaineering skills, providing assistance in terms of disasters in the mountains, etc. So there's something that the ITBP will have to do. Yeah.
And same here. So there is a foreign language school which the army has, where they teach Chinese and they teach Tibetan. But we can do with more, honestly, because you're going to constantly have face off with patrols, etc. If you have somebody who speaks Chinese, these are issues that can be quickly and easily resolved. We have seen on the Chinese side, most patrols do come with an interpreter, so that they're able to converse with each other. But the more language trained people there are, the better it is. Now, Dr. Adlaka has raised his hand. Somehow I can't get him, or see if somebody can promote him to host or co-host or something, and he can ask this question. Can Venkat do that, or somebody who's there?
Yes.
Somehow I'm not getting it on my, I'm not getting it on my screen. Sorry.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to both Jacob and also to General Hooda. Jacob, of course, for bringing out this hidden topic in the public discussion, and General Hooda for enlightening us on various salient features of this issue. My question is related to just the last few words was just now said by General Hooda about while addressing the language issue, and he mentioned about interpreters on the Chinese side. And Jacob also, in addressing a question earlier, had mentioned that it's not a bad thing to look at how some good practices by the Chinese army or PLA, especially they're always looking out for technically or technologically qualified and skilled people to this thing. So my question is that in February this year, when China released the video clips of the ground zero, if I may say it, of what happened in the Galwan incident, and where both the sides were engaged in negotiating the issue, and there was a regional Chinese commander shown in the clip that I think, if I remember the name, some Chifa Pao or something. And the person standing next to him, uniformed, was later on revealed, and who then went on to become a celebrity on Chinese social media. He was the interpreter on the Chinese side with Chief Pao, regional commander, and he was a university graduate, Shantung University graduate, who was actually taken there only to do the interpretation in that situation. I mean, I was just wondering, after listening to these questions related to language, Tibetan, Chinese, interpreter, etc., I mean, even theoretically, is that kind of a scenario thinkable on the Indian side? I mean, this is just language. There might be other technical or technologically qualified people who are just being brought in to help the PLA, who are not actually in PLA. Your thoughts, please.
So, Dr. Hemant, there are interpreters who are posted with the units which are in Ladakh. So it's not as if we completely do not have interpreters. Whenever there are border meetings, there are interpreters present who understand Chinese. So it's not only that the interpretation is only being done from one side. Where you have some important patrols, etc., going, you have interpreters going. As I said, I myself, as the Army Commander, felt that we could do with more interpreters because our interpreters are trained. And in fact, we tried to get a local sort of teacher who could teach units which are in Ladakh. If we could get him to, lay, and then he could run a sort of a brief course for us. So it's not as if we just don't have the capability of interpretation, but yeah, we need more. I mean, that's all I'll say. But it's not as if we are completely without any interpreters.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of want to add only that I'm a big fan of lateral entry and taking in people based on their skills. So certainly, I think where Dr. Hemant Ablaka teaches in JNU is one of the best places for Chinese language anywhere in the country. So, I mean, if the Army were to go out and say, look, we're going to hire your top 5 MA students as interpreters for the Army, I don't see why that shouldn't happen. It requires a mindset change in government, of course, but that's the way to go. And the Chinese do it. They have Hindi speakers, they have Bengali speakers, they have Tamil speakers. They're using Indians to teach these languages in China. So, we have to get ahead of the game now. It's about time.
Okay, so I have just some observations, and these are from obviously military guys who have a view on command and control. So Ranjit Rai says, the Navy teaches us whether in peacetime or war, operational command and control leads to success or failure. In World War II, Lord Mountbatten, though junior, was asked to be commander, Southeast command of all posts. So, yeah. So we understand, Ranjit, the issues of command control, and we've discussed and sort of talked about them. As I said, there are differences in viewpoint and in various organizations. I think there are also some apprehensions. So you could make out from the questions asked that would that mean sort of lateral entry of the Army because they are doing command control. So instead of the IPS, then you're replacing one uniformed force with another. So those kind of apprehensions, I think, need to get addressed. My own sort of recommendation is, if we don't want to apply it all across, let us do a test bed in one area and then see if that arrangement works out better in our response command control. It will also allay some apprehensions, and maybe that's the way to go forward. So I think we've come to the end of our time, Dr. Jacob. Let me just see if there are some other questions. Then, so somebody's sort of given a clarification that SSB original name was Special Services Bureau. So thank you, Dr. Jacob. I'll just take your observations for a couple of minutes if you have any last closing thoughts, and then I will just thank all the participants over here.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think on the last point that Commodore Rai makes, well, you can't use the Coast Guard in internal security duties. So that's one of the reasons why the MHA probably never thought much about handing over control to the Navy. I think and yes, of course, by way of closing remarks, what I'd like to point out is that, I mean, the nature of the border has changed. And it's not just the border itself that's changed, the technology, the technological capabilities, the elements, the human resource capacities, all of this has changed. And yet, my sense is that not just in the ITBP, but also I think largely within the Army, these changes are yet to be thought through and implemented. I think it's obvious from the discussion that there's a huge issue. There are huge issues of coordination, certainly, but also in terms of suspicion, perhaps or tough battles between the different ministries and organizations. And the ITBP is just one force. These sort of issues exist across the board in multiple other armed organizations. Our police system itself is in need of much reform. And essentially, I hope this is sort of a start of a discussion. And if nothing else, like I said at the end, if China doesn't concentrate the mind, then I don't know what will. This is no way to become a global number one. If we can't, one lesson you learn from China is that you have to focus on your internal capacities. If you don't know how to have internal capacities, there's no way you can actually, aspire for global stardom. Yeah. Let me once again thank General Hooda for his presence here, and also for all the questions. I'm afraid not everything we could answer, perhaps, or I could answer satisfactorily. But I've learned much from the discussion, and I hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob. I think subject which is not talked much about. In fact, I got a little surprised when I was told the session is on the ITBP. So, but I think it's come out to be a fascinating discussion, and a lot of issues that, as you said, China and the border management, not only within the ITBP, but I think even the army is going to reconsider and look at how it needs to be done. So thank you very much for a great discussion.